Thanks so much, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, and HRF is very proud to be bringing this particular aspect of the programming to you all today. So we got to start when we think about the idea of Bitcoin as a very powerful human rights tool from the base case for most people, which is that they don't think it has really any use case at all. Constantly, we are confronted in the press and by different government officials from different countries and by academics saying that, Bitcoin really has no use case. I think most people, will acknowledge or admit some sort of speculative investment, but that's about it. And they haven't really understood that Bitcoin represents a fundamental shift in the way that money works around the world. And they have a tremendous, something that I basically call financial privilege that prevents them from seeing that the way they use money, at least here in countries like the United States and in places like Europe, is not the way most people on Earth use money. So this leads to very well-read, intelligent people, including The Atlantic about a year ago, saying that 15 years into its existence, Bitcoin has yet to demonstrate any serious use case. And this is just really head-in-the-sand thinking. And through my talk and through some conversations and talks with some remarkable human rights activists who've come here to be with you today to share how Bitcoin is revolutionizing their work, we're going to get to the bottom of this, and we're going to learn about so many different ways that Bitcoin is empowering people around the world. And again, the reason why so many people don't think too deeply about what Bitcoin does is because of this issue of financial privilege. Remember, very, very few people are born into a monetary economic system as most of us here were born into. This is sort of basically only about 13% of the world's population has access to both a reserve currency, which is obviously, as you know, a currency strong enough that other governments would want it, and democracy, rule of law, and property rights. Okay? So only about 11-12% of the world has access to that, is born into that, is privileged with that. The other 87% or so of the people on this planet live in a place where they either have a collapsing economy with a terrible fiat currency or an authoritarian regime where they don't have free speech or rule of law. Like, that's the base case for most people on Earth. The average savings technology that the average person on this planet uses is either like collapsing paper notes, cattle, or sheet metal. Just think about that for a second. They don't have access to global markets. They can't buy Amazon stock. They can't buy NVIDIA stock. They don't have access to a diverse portfolio. They're completely cut off from a lot of the things here that we have that we use to save ourselves from inflation, basically. Like, economists tell us, look, yes, it's true that the dollar is inflating every year, but at least, you don't save in the dollar. You save in the stock market and bonds, and of course you do. That's the way the economy works. But for most people in the world, that's not the way the economy works. Like, they don't have that access. So Bitcoin represents a fundamental new opportunity and a parallel system that's equal for anyone in the world. Like, anyone can join it. And that's just so profound, especially given that it's literally the best performing financial asset of the last 15 years. So not only are we talking about a technology that is delivering people out of whether it be hyperinflation or even just double-digit inflation or overnight currency devaluations, these things are so common all around the world. A few years ago, about 18 months ago, I was in Malawi, and I got there, and it's a country in southeastern Africa, and about a month before I got there, the country had a 44% overnight currency devaluation. This was overnight. No one had not been warned. Nobody voted on this. They weren't like, hey, who wants to lose 44% of their savings next Wednesday? And this never happened. And the country is known as kind of a democracy. But this is the problem, is that monetary matters are almost never open to the public, never able to be voted on. They're always like some sort of backroom deal. And it's not like these people necessarily needed this kind of devaluation in the first place. Their government, in consultation with bodies like the IMF, may have judged that maybe the country needed a more competitive export system, and therefore the currency needed to be devalued, globally. But again, the people were not consulted. So this means all of a sudden, overnight, they could buy 44% less dollars, real estate, food, water, whatever. And that's the way our world works for so many people. And I think a lot of us are maybe a little oblivious to that. So we don't quite realize the incredibly powerful use case that Bitcoin has to protect people against that kind of basically theft, or in the case of a countrywide, overnight, unannounced currency devaluation, I would call that a crime against humanity. And no one's ever had protection against that, really, until now, until Bitcoin. We're also at an age of unprecedented financial surveillance. If you think about 20, 30 years ago, micro surveillance on the financial system of activists and opposition leaders was very hard to do because a lot of money was just analog. Like, a lot of people still used cash. Even checks are kind of hard to monitor. But as credit cards and now like mobile payments have become really dominant, it's a world where money's gone from being a tool of basically some sort of freedom and privacy to a tool of control, where your transactions are leaked to like huge global marketplaces, and governments are watching, and all different kinds of data brokers are watching and selling your stuff. So you have both surveillance capitalism and just government surveillance to worry about. And in that world, it's a lot easier for governments to spy on and know about what their adversaries are doing, right? So all over the world now, when an autocrat basically is sussing up his opponent, maybe a democracy protester or a civil rights group, an environmentalist group, labor leaders. I mean, one of the first things they do is freeze their bank accounts. This is just standard protocol for any dictator now. It wasn't 40 years ago or 30 years ago, because the technology didn't really exist, but now it does. So you can see this everywhere from Hong Kong to Iran to Nicaragua to Russia. This is just like a matter of course. India perhaps is the world leader in this, and the Modi government is doing this to, again, everybody from Amnesty International to anti-slavery activists to literally the Indian National Congress, the party that Gandhi started. They all had their bank accounts frozen, to Greenpeace. So this is on the menu coming up for, again, any kind of autocratic leader, and sadly, even for some democratic leaders as well, have been seen to abuse this kind of power. So in the face of both essentially the idea of stealing from you through inflation, and then stealing from you and targeting you specifically through censorship, we have a different way of doing things. So this is a pretty prominent post in the Bitcoin community and in the history of Bitcoin. This is from 2019, and there used to be an account that would make fun of Bitcoin called Buttcoin, and says there's not a single thing that Bitcoin can't do for retail that Apple Pay doesn't already do. And this is kind of like the mindset of so many people. They're like, why would you go and use this absurd thing when you can just use Venmo or Apple Pay? And Zia, who's from Iran, and after this post actually has become a huge Bitcoin educator in the country, was imprisoned during the Masa Amini protests, and then was released miraculously. And I was able to meet him a few weeks ago, which was amazing. He comes in and just says, I can't use any of that stuff, but I can use Bitcoin. What do you have to say? And of course, the critic fell totally silent. So I think the important thing here from a human rights and democracy perspective is that with Bitcoin, the ability of these leaders to do these things is completely decimated. So it's so much harder for governments to track people if they use Bitcoin the right way, without linking their ID to it. Obviously, if you're self-custodying your Bitcoin, governments can't delete or freeze your stuff, and they certainly cannot hyperinflate you. So many people from these countries and so many other countries have essentially been saved or rescued because of this technology. And one of the things I want you to take away from this talk, and from all the things you're about to hear from speakers from basically authoritarian regimes, is that Bitcoin is bad for dictators. So we started to understand this at the Human Rights Foundation maybe 6 or 7 years ago. We initially interacted with this idea 10 years ago, in 2013, when Ukrainian protesters under the Yanukovych regime had their bank accounts frozen, and they wanted to do democracy work, which would later end up becoming Maidan Square. And they asked us to help them. And, this was very early on in Bitcoin's life cycle. I mean, Bitcoin was worth like $100 at the time. We were very skeptical that this would work. But you know what? We were open-minded about it, and we tried it, and actually it did work. It got the value to them where, traditional money couldn't go. So our eyes were opened, and we started paying attention. And over the last decade, it has just been like a trickle turned into a deluge of human rights activists using this all over the world. I like to think about it as a parallel construct to encrypted messaging. So in 2010, very, very few global activists used encrypted messaging. You know, tools like Signal just didn't really exist in the form they exist in today. And then, of course, in 2020, 10 years later, everybody was using encrypted messaging, from like, you know, musicians to politicians, et cetera, et cetera. So you're going to see the same thing happen with Bitcoin from 2020 to 2030. So 2020, not that many activists use Bitcoin. Very few global activists used it. Today, halfway through, a lot use it. By 2030, it will be just the standard currency of human rights activism, I think, without question. And you're starting to see that over the years. I mean, you had activists in Russia use Bitcoin because Putin would freeze their bank accounts. You would have activists in Nigeria use Bitcoin when the authorities froze their traditional fintech fundraising apps. You would have activists in Belarus for 5 years now have been using Bitcoin as an upgrade to what they used to have to do, which was so cash into their clothes and go over the border from European countries into Belarus to fund the movements. Now they can use Bitcoin. And, you know, again, this is something that we are insulated from. You know, a lot of us come from these, you know, glowing places here where, again, only about 13% of the world's population are from, and the rest of the world is having to deal with this stuff all the time, is having to deal with the fact that money's a broken system for most people. It doesn't work as well as it does here. And even here, it's starting to break down, right? So whether you're in Venezuela, you know, where people have been saved, there's people here at this conference who are saved. There's a man named Mauricio who's here now, who has an amazing story about how he fled Venezuela with Bitcoin, and it helped him both save his family and start a new career where he can help other people. You've got someone who I'm really privileged to be speaking to at the end of this session, Roya Mahbub from Afghanistan. She started almost 10 years ago doing this work, more than 10 years ago doing this work. And today she's able to educate women in Afghanistan using Bitcoin by paying underground schools and underground teachers to do the work that the Taliban says, you know, you can't do. It's been like 1,500 days since girls could go to school there. But Bitcoin makes it possible. So in all these use cases I've been mentioning, whether it be, again, Belarus or Nigeria or Hong Kong or Afghanistan, just remember, dollars can't do that. You often, again, you hear people say, well, there's no use case for Bitcoin. Well, I'm telling you that all of the things that these people are doing with Bitcoin, it's impossible to use US dollars. Technologically, they just doesn't work. You cannot fund underground education for girls in Afghanistan with US dollars. It doesn't work. But you can use Bitcoin, and people are using it. People who fled Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine had one of the highest per capita participation rates in the Bitcoin economy before the invasion. A lot of them were able to bring their savings with them when they had to flee, and that allowed them, an easier way to resettle. There's also groups just helping, inside Ukraine. We had a remarkable presentation at our Oslo Freedom Forum conference a few weeks ago by a Ukrainian group that's using Bitcoin to help people resettle inside the country. And even in like the darkest corners of the world, this thing is shining a light. So people who escaped North Korea, 70% of them are women. They're often pulled into different trafficking schemes. And what ends up happening is, like, basically they have to be individually rescued. And it's very hard to use US dollars to do that. But Yeonmi Park, who's a survivor of the North Korean system, spoke out about this a few years ago with me on stage at a Bitcoin conference and talked about how Bitcoin is making their life, so much easier on that. So these are just some basic takeaways for you just to think about as you listen to the stories that are going to come next, that Bitcoin cannot discriminate. Its users don't need a bank account. Its users can't be denied based on their nationality or identity. And in the words of the philosophers who preceded me, maybe Bitcoin isn't for everyone. That's fine. Maybe it's not for you, but it is for anyone, and that's quite important. This is some of the data that Professor Krebs shared this morning. I mean, I just think it's sort of undeniable that this is not a fad. This is a growing global trend. I mean, you've got, at one point or another, people owning Bitcoin, 10, 20, 30% of entire countries. This thing is happening, and it's super important that we pay attention to it. And I would submit to you that, again, it's a super positive transformation of our global monetary system, which you know what, just doesn't help a lot of people. A lot of people around the world are left in the cold by the monetary system, and this thing's coming in, and it's helping people where no NGO is willing to go, where the Red Cross can't go, where the UN's refusing to go, where sometimes foreign policy of different countries prevents it from helping people. This thing is helping people everywhere. And again, you'll hear from people in, whether it be Nicaragua or Palestine, people coming up to talk about this later. It is a light in the darkest of places. I think it helps people have a credible escape from the central bank digital currency end game. Essentially, it's like a way out of that. And I think at the end of the day, when we talk about being American and American values, we can think about what do dictators think about Bitcoin as money? And the answer is they don't like it very much. So the Chinese Communist Party has banned Bitcoin as like money. You can't like exchange it for RMB freely, and Putin has banned it as a means of payment inside Russia. So they may try to use it for other use cases, but as far as their citizens using Bitcoin as money, they do not want this. So that should tell you something. Why are dictators so afraid of this thing? Because they need censorship, confiscation, and closed capital markets. But what is Bitcoin and what is America? Free speech, property rights, and open capital markets. We should have no problem with this technology. In fact, I think it will usher in a new, I think, kind of almost like a golden age for America, where our system will be vastly improved by this, whereas it's super bad news for totalitarian regimes and dictators. Here's evidence. This was a few years ago in Venezuela. The regime was trying to block aid from coming in to help the opposition and to help all the people suffering from hyperinflation, and they were able to block the traditional aid coming in. What you don't see in the photo are the millions of dollars of Bitcoin going back and forth that they weren't able to stop. So, the Rubicon has been crossed. The world has changed. And I think it for the better for all of these people. This is a photo I took in Malawi. Again, if you're just sitting there and your money can be devalued overnight by 44%, something's wrong with that system, right? And when we talk about we want to be the change we want to see in the world, look, I'll admit to you as a longtime human rights activist that a lot of the activism is virtue signaling, right? Like free this country on Twitter, what's that really going to do? Not a whole lot. But if you can teach somebody how to use Bitcoin and achieve property rights and financial freedom and free speech for themselves and for their family, for their communities, man, that's real impact. So, that's why I'm submitting to you that pound for pound, helping people how to use Bitcoin. The work that a lot of you are doing here to just promote Bitcoin as this big open monetary network, regardless of whether you're involved in the investment side or the mining side or the policy side, you're all working for Bitcoin, and you're all pushing forward this thing that I really think is the most effective form of human rights activism. And that's why we do what we do at the Financial Freedom Program at HRF. We do it because it's money that dictators can't stop. And the last thing that David specifically mentioned, I should say, which I'm happy to say, is that Bitcoin is free of money, but crypto is not. This is really important. Crypto, thank you. Crypto has use cases. Stablecoins are useful. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, if I lived in Lebanon or Nigeria, yeah, I would want the US dollar. I understand. They're not freedom money, though. They can be censored. They can be rugged. They can go to zero. They can be sanctioned. All this stuff. Like they're not free. They don't actually give people free speech and property rights. In fact, they're growing the role of the state. So just keep that in mind. And everything else, I mean, the system and the rules of all those other tokens are controlled by a handful of people. It's not something where you can have real sovereignty. So this is super important as you move forward. Just remember this. Like, let's be specific when we talk about these things. Crypto is not a helpful term because it's like, are you talking about Fartcoin? Really? Okay. Or are you talking about Dogecoin? Oh, or you're talking about Shiba Inu coin, or whatever it is. It's just like not a helpful term. Let's just be specific. If you want to talk about Solana, talk about Solana. If you want to talk about Circle, talk about Circle. If you want to talk about Tether, talk about Tether. If you want to talk about Bitcoin, talk about Bitcoin. So let's be specific and let's push this thing forward. And please open your ears and join me as we welcome these incredible activists on stage where they're going to teach you how they're using this thing. And I hope you enjoy it. Thank you so much.